This lecture begins with journalist, abolitionist, and feminist Ida B. Wells. In 1893, Wells published a pamphlet to distribute at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, a World's Fair designed to demonstrate the wealth of America's resources. In the pamphlet, Wells denounced the exclusion of African American contributions. This pamphlet and the attention it drew inspired an African American lawyer, Thomas Callaway. He petitioned the U.S. Congress to represent progress made by African Americans since slavery at the World's Fair in Paris 7 years later. The team was successfully awarded $15,000 and exhibition space. This is a view of the Eiffel Tower and the globe from the Exposition Universelle of 1900. On the right is a photo of the exhibition on African American progress on view inside the Palace of Social Economy at the fair. It was designed to be a cabinet of wonder, a scientific look at a full collection of images and artifacts. On this world stage, the African American diaspora was contextualized. As part of the exhibition, 63 data visualizations, 22 by 28 inches, hung in hinged frames. Visitors to the exhibit could turn the large format graphics as they turned the page of a book. Let's go back 4 short months from the opening. In addition to being a key activist in the Harlem Renaissance, W.E.B. Du Bois was a sociologist and, important to the history of graphic design, a pioneer in data visualization. At the request of Thomas Callaway, Du Bois spearheaded the team that created the sociological charts, maps, and graphic images for the exhibition. Du Bois was the likely choice as head of a black school of sociology at Atlanta University, what would become Clark Atlanta University. Heading up the team of students and alumni, Du Bois created the charts, diagrams, and graphics of empirical data he'd collected in his sociological laboratory. Here's a photograph of some of the female students on the step of the university. Let's take a look at some of the visualizations. On the left, a graphic representation of Georgia's urban and rural black populations. Author Silas Monroe describes this chart as defying categorization. It's a combination of bar and pie chart. Color delineates the populations. As one can see at a glance, the overwhelming majority of the black population in Georgia lived in the country. This starts as a simple bar chart. The shifts in color shift in form, and the graphic ends in a spiral with a tapered end. Form is not simply considered, it's a geometric modernist work of art. The mediums for the 63 plates are ink, gouache, watercolor, graphite, and photographic prints on paper. Each is a unique work of art, not a print, but a hand-rendered portrait. Most of the textural information is hand-lettered with a stencil template, but several of the later plates are letterpress typeset and printed. Perhaps time was running out. They created 63 of these with a 4-month deadline, and they had to transport across the ocean, which would take 6 weeks. The portrait on the right illustrates the rise and fall and then rise again of free Black Americans. On the right side of the visualization, we see a sharp, clean-lined, geometric shape to represent free Black American citizens. The left shape, the black shape that represents enslaved people, is ripped. It's a graphic statement of the struggle of chattel slavery. This visual portrait details the income and expenditure of 150 black families in Atlanta. Pastel-colored and black bars illustrate how much the families spent on rent, on food, clothes, and other expenses. It was imperative, as Ida B. Wells wrote 7 years earlier, that black people control their own narrative in these public, global spaces. W.E.B. Du Bois and his team represented a community of teachers, businessmen, innovators with patents to their names, educated, tax-paying citizens. The goal of the graphics was to communicate the population's literacy, industrial development, religious affiliations, to tell the story of an emerging people. It was about 37 years of progress after emancipation. Let's look at 2 more charts of the 63. On the left, a curvilinear bar chart shows the increased value of household furniture over a period of 25 years. And on the right, 4 circles float on a white field. They emphasize the growth of Black American teachers. Primary colors, modernist geometry, rational objectivity. These are the foundational principles of the modernist movement. These graphics, on a world stage, were on display almost 2 decades before the celebrated German design school, that we credit as one of the most influential currents in modern design, opens its doors. Du Bois and his team understood how visual data can reveal the human condition and the social relationships. This was not a platform for presenting scientific data. This was designed to bring about social change. Ultimately, this was graphic design, data visualization in the service of social activism. Fast forward almost 20 years. From 1919 until 1933, this small German design school, with a total of 33 faculty members and 1,250 students, changed design and design education in revolutionary ways. The Bauhaus invented the modern-day art student, an independent thinker allowed to explore his or her ideas. Before the Bauhaus, students were middle-class conformist thinkers, all sitting around, sort of doing the same thing. And so, from the beginning, the Bauhaus attracted a politically and artistically radical student. The Bauhaus was a school in Germany of architecture, design, and craftsmanship. Bauen means build, Haus means house. So together, in German, it forms the public house of building. The original Bauhaus philosophy was published in a manifesto and first ran in the newspaper, and then in book form. The complete building is the ultimate aim of all visual arts. It meant every aspect of the building itself. Paintings, furniture, windows are all equal to architecture. As a result, students had a chance to work with a much wider selection of techniques and materials than was usual. They had glass workshops, metal workshops, wood, textiles. On the title page of this manifesto was a woodcut of an American raised artist, Lionel Feininger. He was also a prominent expressionist artist and an instructor at the Bauhaus. The director of the school and German architect, Walter Gropius, wrote the Bauhaus Manifesto. He was creating an incubator for modernist teachings. The new design school was metaphorically to be a cathedral of socialism. The Gothic cathedral symbolized all the Bauhaus was about, the integration of architecture, sculpture, painting, and crafts. The text, longing for spiritual beauty that was deeper than utility needs, read more like a sermon than a manifesto. The Bauhaus began in Weimar, Germany in 1919. It moved to Dessau in 1925 for political reasons that I'll discuss. And finally, in 1932, it moved to Berlin, where the Nazi Party, in April 1933, under Adolf Hitler, shut it down in Germany for good, sealing its fate as martyrdom in the history of graphic design. On April 12, 1919, Weimar Art Academy merged with Weimar Arts and Crafts to become the Bauhaus. Under its original philosophy, it sought a new unity of art and handicraft. It was taught through workshops, co-taught by an artist and a craftsman. The first director of the Bauhaus at age 36 was Walter Gropius. He was trained as an architect. His design philosophy was that of the American architect Louis Sullivan, form follows function, which essentially means the aesthetic grows out of the function and use of the object. Gropius was part of the Deutsche Werkbund, embracing the philosophy of Gossam culture. In other words, he believed in elevating the functional and aesthetic qualities of mass-produced consumer products and acknowledged the value of machines. The first students who arrived at the Bauhaus were confronted by a peculiar provision outlined in the school's program. One of its key principles dictated that students participate in extracurricular activities such as theater, lectures, poetry, music, and even costume parties, at which they were expected to contribute to a, quote, lighthearted or, quote, cheerful atmosphere. Students not only lived and dined together, but also spent their free time playing sports, designing publications, organizing parties and festivals, and collaborating on art projects. Parties at the Bauhaus were legendary and often elaborately themed, involving sets and costumes that required expertise from the different workshops. The preliminary course explored theories of color and form, principles of composition, studies of materiality, exercises in life drawing, and also visual analysis. More specialized courses in theory were led by German expressionists Paul Klee and Wassily Kandinsky. The various exercises students performed in these courses represented an effort to promote a holistic education. The divergent trajectories students might follow at the Bauhaus were represented together in the circular diagram. The singularity of the circle suggests the holistic nature of a Bauhaus education, in which individual students representing diverse disciplinary backgrounds were to come together in pursuit of a shared mission to reform art, design, and society. Walter Gropius attracted an impressive faculty to the Bauhaus in the early years. Along with Lionel Feininger, he hired expressionist faculty Johannes ITTEN. ITTEN was considered a spiritualist, practicing Far Eastern mysticism. He would have his students practice preparatory meditation exercises before every class. ITTEN embodied the philosophy of the early years at the Bauhaus, not only in his spiritual mysticism, but also in his process of teaching. He established the preliminary course, which many design schools still have in place today. The Art Foundation year was designed after the Bauhaus curriculum and its preliminary course. He's known for his expressionist theories on color, and he developed a color wheel based on those theories. He had students analyze old masters' paintings, and he also emphasized visual contrasts in many of his lessons. To understand his teaching methods, let's take a look at his student work. In the project on the upper left, ITTEN was using an exercise to emphasize expression with line contrasts and weight. Next to that, a piece where a student physically carved a grid of textures out of wood to understand patternization and repetition. Beside that, found textures were collaged into grid patterns, and then students turned their abstract materials into representational or realistic works that you see in the upper right. Like that student collage that uses contrasts and textures to represent urban architectural forms and environments, note in all of these the physical, hands-on, tactile quality of these projects. The two lower images are studies of matter from 1922, wood, glass cylinder, and metal nailed to a board. In addition to his textural studies, ITTEN placed an emphasis on visual contrasts. For example, large to small, high to low, thick to thin, broad to narrow, physical contrasts like transparent to opaque, smooth to rough, or more obscure like rest to motion, and then much to little. These were just some of the visual contrasts in his theory. Along with contrast and textures, ITTEN developed a 12-hue color wheel that changed the way we see color, inventing a color circle and 7 contrasts. He wrote about and analyzed color from every aspect. Not just the physical aspect, but the psychological and even the philosophical aspect of color. ITTEN's theories were revolutionary because he looked at color not only on how light is absorbed or reflected by matter, or how one color looks beside or within another. ITTEN studied how color affects a person psychologically. He was interested in the deep influence of colors around us. He considered the psychic and emotional values of color. For example, how blue is perceived to be cold. In 1921, Dutch designer Theo van Doesburg, seen here with his wife Nellie, moved to Weimar. He had approached Gropius about teaching at the school, but Gropius refused, saying he was too dogmatic in his belief. Gropius did not want a Bauhaus style, so van Doesburg never taught at the Bauhaus. However, he lived in Weimar from 1921 until 1923. His home became a meeting place for Bauhaus students and faculty alike, and he had a major impact on the emerging Bauhaus style. As a result, by 1923, the Bauhaus had all but given up its romantic medievalism and expressionist beliefs and replaced these with an applied design emphasis. So this philosophy of a unity of art and handicraft evolved into art and technology, a new unity. Contrast the first Bauhaus seal that you see here, created in 1919, to the Bauhaus seal that was designed by Oskar Schlemmer in 1923. The original seal represented the union of artists and craftsmen. It was more folk art style and hand-carved. Look how it changed into a geometric Bauhaus seal. Everything, even the letter forms, became more geometric. Rectilinear shapes formed the face with eyes on the future. The seal is a strong sign of the turbulent changes that took place. Now, about this time of change, the government officials of Weimar forced the state-run school to have a major exhibition. Since it was supported by national funds, the Bauhaus needed to demonstrate its accomplishments to the people of the Weimar Republic. This is a poster designed in 1923 for the Bauhaus exhibition. Just Schmidt, a student at the time, created this poster of pure geometric form, and notice how it contains the Bauhaus seal. The dynamic diagonal of elementarism exposes the major influence of Theo van Doesburg. On the right is the exhibition catalog cover, and that was also designed by a student, Herbert Bayer. Bold sans serif type forms a perfect square design. With letter weight and width, the geometric shape is formed from the typographic page. The 1923 exhibition showed the first years of the Bauhaus to an international audience. It also demonstrated in its design a major shift from early German expressionism to constructivism. As part of the exhibition, the Bauhaus constructed the Haus am Horn. It was a simple cubic design, utilizing steel and concrete in its construction. Visitors could walk through the experimental residential house and see Bauhaus furniture and designed objects created in the workshops. In 1923, another major change took place. With this philosophical shift, ITTEN soon left, disagreeing with the new focus on technology. The preliminary course was taken over by a Hungarian constructivist, László MOHOLY-NAGY. Expressionist theories shifted to an emphasis on the construction of form for manufacturing and production. Associated with the Berlin Dada and El Lissitzky, this Hungarian constructivist took over as the director of the preliminary course and head of the metal workshop. He changed the metal workshops from producing one-of-a-kinds to creating prototypes for industry. So he reinvented the Bauhaus toward mass-manufactured objects. He was a practicing painter, photographer, filmmaker, sculptor, and a graphic designer at the school. So he put far more emphasis on visual communications. He believed in the integration of word and photo and called his photographic type compositions typophoto. This typophoto that you see here is a poster designed to sell tires from 1923. MOHOLY-NAGY wrote that typography was a tool of communication. The emphasis of letter forms should be on clarity and legibility. He believed that type should be uninhibited from rigid rules of horizontal articulation. We see photography become more versatile as a design element. Photography was the medium he redefined, pushing the boundaries with new processes. In 1923, he began experimenting with Dada photomontages that he called photoplastics. On the left, legs lose their representational value completely and become textural contrasts of light and dark. MOHOLY-NAGY worked not only with camera images, but also with cameraless light images. In 1922, he began experimenting with photograms. A photogram is an image made with cameraless photography simply by exposing objects to a photosensitive paper in the darkroom. He used light and shadows to design space. Here is a self-portrait photogram. MOHOLY-NAGY incorporated what was going on in the industrial mechanical world into his work and teachings at the Bauhaus. The Bauhaus struggled in Weimar and under state control. On December 26, 1924, the entire faculty resigned. Their last day would be April 1, 1925. 2 weeks later, students informed the government they were leaving with the faculty. Gropius moved the Bauhaus to Dessau. Dessau was an industrial city to the north. Because of industry, more money was available, and as a result, more liberal thinking. Out from under the control of the Weimar Republic, the Bauhaus was now run more like a corporation that sold their prototypes to industry. As the architect, Gropius developed plans for the new complex. On the left are Gropius's drawings for the school. The style and constructivist underpinnings are obvious. Gropius applied what is called a factory aesthetic. Glass walls formed the entire face of the building, supported by the steel and concrete building material. Black, white, and gray made up of horizontal and vertical lines. On the right is the Fagas shoe factory designed by Gropius a decade before the Bauhaus complex was built in Dessau. This factory aesthetic was embedded in the physical and philosophical presence of the Dessau Bauhaus. Student workshops were filled with light. They were uncluttered. They were severe and clinical. Professors looked less like artists and more like chemists and mathematicians. Here's a view of the metal shop to get an idea of how the workshops were flooded with light. Here's an early photo of the Bauhaus building from another perspective, and a wider view from the northeast angle. These last photos were taken by Lucia Moholy, Moholy-Nagy's wife, and a photojournalist who, in addition to the buildings, documented many of the people and events at the Bauhaus. Here's a view of the student housing with balconies, Walter Gropius's elevation of the building in the top right, and under that, László Moholy-Nagy's extreme worm's eye view. In addition to the school and dormitories, Gropius created a compound for his factory. These are the master's houses. On the top left was Gropius's house, along with 2 angles of Moholy-Nagy's. This is the Bauhaus today. It's not the school that it was, but open studio workshops are offered to design programs around the world. And by offering these workshops, it remains an experimental site of education in the arts and in design. The team of Moholy-Nagy and Gropius co-edited a series of books, which played a pivotal role in spreading Bauhaus ideas throughout the world. It's a series of 14 books, 11 shown here, to disseminate Bauhaus theories and ideas about architecture and design. On the right is one of the books I showed in the DESSAU lecture. This book acknowledges Theo van Doesburg's contributions to the principles of the Bauhaus. The admissions literature for the Bauhaus described an egalitarian community with, quote, absolute equality, but also absolute equal duties, unquote. But if you were a promising young architect and you were a woman, chances are you were still shuffled off to the weaving department after you completed the preliminary course, regardless of your interests. Günther Stolz was the director of the weaving workshop, and after the 1923 exhibition, she moved the weaving department to the forefront in developing prototypes for the textile industry. And as a result of the talented young women that were channeled into that department, the weaving department became one of the most financially successful workshops of the Bauhaus, creating some of the most striking visual textiles. Vivid, abstract pattern, rich colors created rich textures and contrasting tones. The chair on the right shows the new experimental material from the program woven and applied to modern furniture. Stolz was passionate about working with new materials. The image on the left is a sketch by Stolz, driven to explore new ideas as they applied to industrial design. The weaving workshop eventually became a laboratory for industrial fabrics. These are just a few of the beautiful textiles that Günther Stolz designed. 5 former students eventually became faculty. Joseph Albers was one. He took over a portion of ITTEN's preliminary course from Moholy-Nagy, and he taught through experimentation. Students discovered basic principles in his classes through hands-on education. Like ITTEN, he became primarily interested in color and color theory, and he began an in-depth study of his color theory. Albers is best known for his experiments and studies in color later in his life. Albers' life passion was for exploring how colors work scientifically, subjectively, and subconsciously. He believed it is almost impossible to see a color not interacting with its surroundings, and that color is understood only through experience. Color is absolute and yet relative to its surroundings. Joseph Albers painted over 2,000 paintings in his Homage to the Square series between 1950 and 1976. Mostly oil on masonite panel, Homage to the Square was a lifelong preoccupation. In this series, color assumes the main role, producing deceptive and unpredictable effects, changing based on the color that surrounds it. His paintings took only a few hours each to execute, but were preceded by intense color studies in oil, or sometimes gouache on blotting paper. You can see that on the bottom right. He continued explaining color in this format for the remainder of his life. Here's an exhibition on the series Homage to the Square. After passing his final journeyman's exam, Herbert Bayer was appointed head of the printing and advertising and typography workshops in Dessau. Here you see Herbert Bayer in a 1922 card he designed. In 1925, Gropius hired Bayer to design the signage for the new Bauhaus building complex in Dessau. These are just some of Bayer's postcards for the 1923 exhibition. They were hand-rendered letter forms and geometric shapes. This exhibition poster from 1926 is for his Bauhaus master teacher Vasily Kandinsky's 60th birthday. He set the design up on a vertical and horizontal alignment, but then he rotated the design for a more dynamic diagonal axis. In 1925, Behr designed the universal alphabet. Gropius commissioned Behr to design a typeface for the Bauhaus communication. So he created what he called an idealist typeface. Writing about the concept, he asked, why should we write and print in two different alphabets? Both a large sign and a small sign are not necessary to identify a single sound. He basically reduced the alphabet to clear, simple, rational form, eliminating the need for capital letters. On the left is a cover for Bauhaus magazine from 1928. Behr composed both the type and image in the camera. This highly conceptual design has been mimicked over and over again. On the right is a self-portrait from 1932. After vacationing in Paris, he gained an appreciation for the art of photography and surrealism, and he became quite proficient at photography. Think about it, he created this before the computer and digital retouching. In 1928, Walter Gropius resigned because of the political polarization that was happening at the Bauhaus. There was a strong communist faction of students and faculty that placed more emphasis on vocational training and not on theoretical and conceptual development. Behr and MOHOLY-NAGY soon followed. Gropius would later go on to become the dean of the Harvard Graduate School of Design, where he produced America's first generation of modernists. In 1930, a prominent Berlin architect took over the Bauhaus, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. He's famous for his dictum, "Less is more," and you see that in his architecture. This is part of the 1929 International Exposition in Barcelona, Spain. Originally named the German Pavilion, the pavilion was the face of Germany after World War I, emulating the nation's progressively modern culture. And in 1932, the Nazi Party drove the Bauhaus out of Dessau. Mies van der Rohe moved it to an empty telephone factory in Berlin. On August 10, 1933, the Gestapo, under Hitler's orders, padlocked the doors, and Mies van der Rohe officially closed the Bauhaus in Germany for good. After modernism and modernist ideas swept Europe, we see radical shifts in the typographic page. This is what came to be known as the new typography. It forged a new visual aesthetic to not only book design, but all other printed matter as well. Its characteristics are asymmetry, loss of embellishment, all that ornamentation was stripped of the design. Even the ornament of serifs on the letter forms were removed. And the new typography's aim and ultimate function was communication, no longer shackled by the formal conventions of the past. To establish some kind of historical context, let's look at this example of classic book design. Typography, well into the 20th century, followed the standards that had been in place since the mid-1400s, the days of Gutenberg. Centered typographical alignment, justified with both the right and the left edges flush, and many designs still incorporating heavy use of ornamentation and decorative letter forms. Pages of books followed formulaic principles. Eventually, everything the printer and typesetter produced followed the same classic typographic rules: serif type, centered text, symmetrical layouts, and advertising all looked the same, with nothing standing out, but instead all competing at the same typographic volume of noise. So back to the new typography, and the man at the forefront of this widespread movement, Jan Tschichold. His background was key to the success of the new typography. You see, he was a traditionally trained calligrapher, and in 1923, he attended the Bauhaus exhibition in Weimar and became a modernist. His work was so heavily influenced by that Bauhaus exhibition that he dramatically changed everything about his aesthetic. And respected in the field of printing and typography, he was in a prime position to introduce a new set of rules to printers, typographers, and designers of the publication industry. Because of his teaching and his publishing and his professional practice and his type designs, Jan Tschichold was one of the most influential typographers of the 20th century. As a boy, Tschichold would help his father in his sign painting business. This is where the young Tschichold learned calligraphy. This is a business card on the left that he hand-lettered in 1923 as part of his professional freelance practice. Even compare the hand-lettered ad from 1922 by Tschichold on the right to the French 13th century illuminated manuscript on the left. Every line is centered on the page. Also the use of historical serif letter forms. Scripts follow the Gothic rotunda letter forms of the manuscript with hand-lettered brushstrokes. Majuscule letter forms in the heading were based on historiated initials and illuminated texts. So again, in 1923, Jan Tschichold attends the first Bauhaus exhibition in Weimar and was introduced to this radically new typographic language. Like everyone who attended this exhibition, he was first shocked by the unfamiliar, but he was enlightened by this new approach of form and fascinated by its impact and its organization. And now compare his cinema poster on the right for the film The Trousers, designed in 1927, to the poster that was designed 4 years earlier for the Bauhaus exhibition. Both use a diagonal axis. Typography emphasizes functionality and establishes a hierarchy of legibility. The ultimate goal is communication, and each message appears in the shortest, simplest, and most forceful form. And to take it a step further, Tschichold's typography is stripped of all the unnecessary ornamentation. Sans serif fonts are in many variations and weights and sizes. He used these geometrical elements and diagonal arrangements in a series of cinema posters. Rarely printed in more than 2 colors, these designs incorporated small halftone photographs in geometric shapes like cutout circles that you see here, or even silhouetted. And the text was often hand-drawn, but it was always sans serif. He was only 22 years old when he began to develop mass communication toward the style of the Bauhaus, this elementary and functional design. Tschichold is now placing more emphasis on the arrangement of the type than his former aesthetic of handmade artistry and calligraphic form. In 1925, he published an article called Elementare Typographie in a German journal where he explained principles for the revolutionary new type. Tschichold published his views in the 24-page insert that ran in the popular typographic journal. He explained concepts of typophoto and Russian constructivism using both László MOHOLY-NAGY's designs and Liszty's pages from For the Voice. Tschichold was teaching a wide audience of printers and typesetters and designers the principles of the new typography, not as some radical revolt against their industry, but on their own terms as one of them. His article caused an uproar. It inspired heated discussions. Every typesetter in Germany and eventually Europe was talking about Jan Tschichold and the new typography. Some of the mainstream printers passionately adopted his radical thinking, and some of the traditionalists vehemently rejected it and stayed true to their old traditions. But within a few years, heavy use of ornaments, antiquated typefaces, and centered typesetting was all but abandoned in the publishing industry. In 1928, Tschichold introduced his seminal book, De Nieuwe Typografie. The book set out a series of stern foundational principles for good design: the use of sans serif fonts, standardized paper sizes, photographs rather than drawn illustrations, asymmetrical rather than centered layouts. He was trying to bring typography into line with other industrial products of the modern age. He argued for clarity of message because of the extraordinary amount of print flooding the consumer market and all vying for the reader's attention. This exhibition poster for a 1937 exhibit on constructivism uses geometry to connect the elements of the design. Weight and point size emphasize the title of the exhibition. This radical aesthetic shift in German communication ran counter to Hitler's propaganda of a nationalist style. The Nazi Party remained deeply suspicious of modernism, regarding it as fundamentally un-German. And after Tschichold took up a teaching post in Munich, he was denounced as a cultural Bolshevik. Only 10 days after the Nazis surged to power in March of 1933, Tschichold was taken into protective custody. The authorities had made it clear that progressive ideas would not be tolerated. After 4 weeks in prison and with no prospect of work in Germany, Tschichold and his family soon took refuge in Switzerland, leaving Germany in August of 1933. With an established reputation and connections with the School of Arts and Crafts in Basel, Switzerland, Tschichold was soon teaching, designing posters, curating exhibitions, and writing on typographic practice and history. In 1946, he denounced the new typography, writing, "Its impatient attitude conforms to the German bent for the absolute, which led to Hitler's rise to power." During the 1940s, Tschichold became a typographer for Pelican Books in London. He reverted back to his traditional typographic roots, using Roman fonts and classical symmetrical layouts. He abandoned the asymmetrical arrangements of the industrial typography developed in Germany and began to center almost all of his designs. Illustrations replaced photography, and serifs were reaffixed to his letter forms. He ended up designing over 500 covers and title pages for Pelican books. Let me talk about 3 key type designers for the new typography. Paul Renner designed the purely geometric Futura. He created it for the type foundry in Germany, the Bauer foundry. Futura was designed from simple geometric forms, and the strokes are based on near even weight, as if machined, not hand-rendered. Renner avoided the decorative, eliminating all non-essential elements. Stanley Morrison is credited for supervising the creation of Times New Roman for the British Monotype Corporation and their client, the London Times. And Rudolf Koch designed a rational sans serif named Cable, but with a less rigid geometric structure than Futura. Here we see Renner's Futura. The Bauer foundry could market this practical sans serif to mainstream typesetters and printing firms. It was built on the geometry of circles, rectangles, and triangles. But here we see Renner's original design for Futura, a far more experimental, even intellectual attempt compared to the face we use today. Futura was made up of 15 different styles, ranging from italic to bold. Renner's experiments with sans serif lettering were a manifestation of the new typography and Herbert Bayer's universal alphabet. So Stanley Morrison and the Monotype Corporation were commissioned by the London Times in 1931 to redo and update the appearance of its newspaper. The new type design completely changed the look of the London Times overnight. You can see on the left the old, and you can see on the right the new. Times New Roman made it more legible, and at the same time, the design allowed for more text on the page, making it more economical to print. The left page is set in the original Times, the right page is set in Times New Roman. Because the face is slightly more condensed, more information can fit into a smaller space. Disclaimer though, the version you have on your computer was one of the earliest fonts to be digitized in the mid-1980s. And because no typesetter was involved in the translation to the digital, a consistent, well-crafted form was lost in translation, and it's a poor quality of the original. And in 1928, Rudolf Koch designed a sans serif typeface called Cable. He was primarily a calligrapher interested in black letter style typography or medievalist fonts. These 2 images are from a series of ad specimen sheets the Type Foundry used to introduce Cable's range of weights to German designers and printers. Type historian Walter Tracy writes, Koch probably drew his letters with constraint and then rationalized them afterwards. Koch was evidently not a man to be bound by arbitrary rules. In Cable Light, for example, the arms of the E are actually 3 different lengths. The bowl of the R is deeper than that of the B, and in P it is deeper still. In short, Koch's sense of style is in command rather than any geometric formula. The result is an alphabet of capitals that relate perfectly without need of mathematical harmony. Over 2 decades after W.E.B. Du Bois's data portraits visualized Black America, a Vienna sociologist, Otto Neurath, conceived a system of elementary pictographs to communicate the complex statistical data and vital information about public affairs. Like Du Bois, Neurath believed that the ordinary citizen should get information freely about all subjects in society. The system this Vienna sociologist conceived is called isotypes. It's an acronym for the International System of Typographic Picture Education. These were the sort of images that Otto collected as a boy. He was attracted to the prints on brightly colored paper called shinies, and influenced by the severity and geometry of the Egyptian wall paintings he saw in the Vienna Museum. He understood how these simple pictures could clearly communicate the daily life of the Egyptians and were a systematic way to write and convey information. With this knowledge, he developed a system of pictographic communication. Not nearly as beautiful as the visualizations created by Du Bois and his students, but these are some examples of isotype designs. The elemental pictographs made the data much more widely accessible and faster to decipher and interpret. In the chart on the left, if you compare the US to Great Britain, France, and Germany, it's easy to discern which country has an overwhelming amount of motor cars. What Neurath liked best were strong, simplified shapes. His graphics could reduce to under 1/4 of an inch and still be clear. So a quick glance at the chart on the right about occupations of women shows us that a significant number of women in the population of 1930 Japan were working in agriculture compared to very few in the US. It really didn't matter to Neurath if a picture were crude or roughly drawn as long as it was simplified and gave information directly. This is the precedence for the icons of our computer desktops. Early graphic pictures influenced the information design and interaction we use today. Henry Beck was an electrical draftsman, not a graphic designer. He created a London Underground map, graphically simplifying a conventional map with a grid and color coding. While riding on the subway, it occurred to Beck that electrical circuitry was much like the subway, so he applied his knowledge of a circuit diagram to produce a simplified, easy-to-follow, diagrammatic map of the London Underground. This was the original map before Beck's redesign. The map literally follows the geographic paths of the trains. And this is what Beck designed, the map for the London Underground from 1933. Beck used color coding for each of the routes, and the complex interchanges were simplified and enlarged. And generally speaking, it was just simple reduction of form applied to a map. Known as the tube map, this famous line diagram has been emulated by many transport organizations throughout the world. Henrik Werkman was a Dutch designer and highly influential typographer and printmaker. This is a facsimile collection of his druksels, or little prints. He worked with large type, found material, and intuitive placement. Werkman used objects and type in the letterpress shop as a painter used brushes. He had his own letterpress shop where he began creating typographic printing experiments. Werkman developed a printmaking process he called hot printing. It was a technique where he incorporated found materials that he inked and transferred directly onto paper. For example, that red form in the print on the left was a metal brass plate from a door in his letterpress studio. In this spread for his publication The Next Call, Werkman illustrated a global event with letterpress typography. Its concrete form visualizes Vladimir Lenin's funeral. The M's and O's form the pallbearers carrying Lenin's casket. Compositions were created from letter forms turned and repositioned onto the page. Werkman also produced underground booklets written by Jewish dissident poets and writers during the Nazi occupation of Holland. In 1945, Werkman was imprisoned by German SS and executed without a trial, just 3 days before the country's liberation. Much of his work was destroyed in a fire at the time. One of the most important figures in Dutch graphic design was Willem Sandberg, the museum director of the Stedelijk in Amsterdam from 1945 to 1962. He designed almost all of the printed matter for the Stedelijk, over 250 catalogs and 270 posters. In 1940, the Germans occupied the Netherlands. Sandberg became involved in subversive activities like forging documents. Like many other typographers, he was forced to go underground, and in hiding, Sandberg had little resources and began to produce experiments with torn paper. These eventually became the basis for the catalog ideas for the Stedelijk, called Experimenta Typographica. This is a page from Experimenta Typographica, 1956. It's a cover design about the utility of jugs. The lowercase letter U in the word krugs, or jugs, becomes the object itself and holds the water, indicated with the blue W's. Sandberg played with severe shapes of type using collage and torn paper. He used his own handwriting in some of the museum catalogs. And he explored negative and positive form in typographic expression. You see more of his torn typography combined with typeset letter forms. In addition to playing with a variety of paper stocks, like you see here, he invited the interactivity of the reader. He used unexpected materials like brown wrapping paper and intentionally left the imperfections in the printing process. Our final designer in this lecture worked with the camera the way modern designers worked with typography. Herbert Matter grew up in Switzerland. In his Swiss posters, he used collages of images that became pictography, cropped from their backgrounds and repositioned on the page. For impact, he used extreme scale shifts in his photography. He incorporated type and illustration on a diagonal. Matter pioneered the extreme scale shifts and the use of black and white photography. These pioneers of the new typography challenged convention, experimented with new form and technologies, and pushed the boundaries of design and typography and image making.